Talking about self-love has become trendy. Everyone says they love themselves. Everyone posts beautiful quotes. Everyone repeats that they put themselves first. But hardly anyone talks about the uncomfortable side of self-love, the part that hurts, that demands hard decisions, and forces you to face truths you've been avoiding for years. Self-love isn't about feeling good all the time. It's about choosing yourself even when that means being alone, disappointing someone, or letting go of old versions of yourself that once felt safe. The truth is, a lot of people use the language of self-love as a disguise to keep self-sabotaging. They say they love themselves, but they keep settling for crumbs, staying in environments that drain them, and negotiating their worth just to hold on to affection. And that's not love, that's fear. Real self-love isn't comfortable or romantic. It's quiet, steady, and deeply transformative. And once you understand that, your life will never be the same. If this topic has already touched something inside you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and stick with me, because what comes next might completely change the way you relate to yourself. First topic: self-love is not a feeling, it's a decision. For a long time, I thought self-love was something you feel, a beautiful, light, constant emotional state. I believed that the day I finally loved myself, everything would become easier. But that never happened, because self-love doesn't arrive as an emotion. It begins as a choice, and most of the time as a hard one. I realized this the day I had to say no to something I really wanted, but that was making me small. It wasn't liberating at first. It was painful. I felt selfish, ungrateful, confused. But in that moment, for the first time, I respected myself more than I respected the fear of losing something. And that changed everything. Self-love isn't about feeling confident every day. It's acting with dignity even when insecurity is screaming. It's walking away from comfortable but wrong situations. It's refusing to bargain your boundaries to keep people, places, or stories that have already expired. A lot of people confuse self-love with high self-esteem. But the truth is, you can feel insecure and still love yourself deeply, as long as you choose not to abandon yourself. Real self-love shows up when you do what's right for you, not what's easiest. And that almost never comes with applause. Sometimes it comes with silence, with distance, with doubts. But it also brings something powerful, inner peace. Comment: I choose myself. That phrase is the beginning of the kind of self-love that sustains you, not the kind that depends on your mood. Second topic: self-love will distance you from people you love. This is one of the hardest truths to accept. Truly loving yourself will make you lose people, not because you've become cold, arrogant, or selfish, but because you've stopped shrinking yourself to fit into places where you were never fully respected. Self-love changes your posture, and when your posture changes, not everyone can stay. I felt this when I started setting boundaries. People who had always benefited from my availability started calling me distant. Others said I had changed, and changed in that context simply meant I no longer accepted the bare minimum. It hurt to realize that some relationships only existed as long as I kept making myself smaller to preserve them. True self-love doesn't beg to stay. It observes. It respects the signs. It understands that losing people also creates space for more aligned, more mature, more genuine connections. But before that understanding comes, there's grief. There's guilt. There's the feeling of being wrong for prioritizing your own peace. And this is where many people give up on self-love. Not because they can't love themselves, but because they can't handle the discomfort that comes at the beginning. But the discomfort is temporary. Dignity is permanent. When you love yourself, you stop justifying behavior that hurts you. You stop over-explaining. You stop accepting emotional crumbs just to avoid being alone. And that scares those who got used to your lack of boundaries. Comment: I won't abandon myself to keep anyone. That phrase is a powerful reminder that self-love doesn't push love away. It pushes away what was never real love in the first place. Third topic: self-love requires emotional responsibility. There's a part of self-love that almost no one likes to admit. When you love yourself, you stop blaming others for everything you feel. You can no longer place the responsibility for your happiness, frustration, or lack of boundaries on someone else's shoulders. Self-love matures, and maturity demands emotional responsibility. I realized this when I caught myself repeating the same sentence. If people were different, I'd be better. Thinking that way was comfortable. It put me in the victim role, but it also kept me stuck. It was only when I accepted that I was allowing too much that I actually started to change. Not because others got better, but because I became more aware. Self-love isn't waiting to be treated well. It's choosing not to stay where you aren't treated with respect. It's not demanding someone change. It's changing your stance in relation to what's hurting you. That hurts. because it shatters the illusion of control over others. But it gives you something much more valuable: control over yourself. When you take emotional responsibility, you stop reacting impulsively, stop expecting others to understand your pain, and start acting with clarity. You choose hard conversations, necessary silences, and conscious distance. Not out of anger and out of respect. Many people confuse self-love with rigidity, when in reality, it's clarity. It's understanding that you can't control everything that happens, but you can choose what you continue to live through. There's a part of self-love that hardly anyone connects to, but that sustains everything. The security of knowing you have the power to choose. Because it's hard to truly love yourself when deep down you're living in fear of money, fear of lacking, fear of depending, fear of not being able to leave situations that hurt you because financially, you can't right now. That silent fear puts you in a constant state of compromise. You accept less, tolerate more, and stay silent when you want to speak up. And little by little, that erodes the self-love you're trying to build. I realized that working on my emotional self-esteem didn't matter if, in practice, my life was still ruled by financial insecurity. Self-love is also about structure. It's about stability. It's knowing you can walk away, choose, say no, change course without panicking. And that doesn't come from how much you earn, but from how you relate to money. That awareness was the foundation of the Wealth Code, a guide created to transform your relationship with money in a simple, accessible way that's deeply aligned with real self-love. It's not just about finances. It's about inner security, emotional freedom, and the peace of knowing your choices don't depend on anyone's approval or support. Because truly loving yourself also means building a life where you don't have to abandon yourself to survive. If this spoke to you, the link to the Wealth Code is in the first pinned comment. Fourth topic: self-love will make you uncomfortable before it sets you free. There's a dangerous lie about self-love that almost no one questions: the idea that it brings immediate comfort. It doesn't, at least not in the beginning. Real self-love puts you in uncomfortable situations because it asks you to leave familiar places, even if those places have been hurting you for years. I experienced this when I began stepping away from situations that no longer made sense but still felt familiar. The discomfort didn't come from the change itself. It came from breaking the pattern. My body was used to chaos, anxiety, and the constant urge to please. When I chose peace, it felt strange, like something was wrong, and that almost made me go back. This is where a lot of people confuse discomfort with a mistake, but it's not. Sometimes discomfort is just a sign that you're leaving behind an old version of yourself. Self-love doesn't numb you, it wakes you up. It makes you feel everything more clearly, and feeling hurts before it heals. When you start respecting yourself, you have to deal with the emptiness that's left, where there was once excess, too many explanations, too much compromise, too much tolerance for the bare minimum. That emptiness is scary, but it's not abandonment, it's space. Space for healthier relationships, more conscious decisions, and a life that doesn't require you to shrink to fit in. Self-love doesn't arrive with a celebration. It comes with silence, with pauses, with choices no one sees, but that change everything. Comment: I accept the discomfort of my growth. That phrase acknowledges that freedom begins where comfort ends. Fifth topic: self-love isn't prioritizing yourself sometimes. It's respecting yourself always. Many people believe that self-love is something you practice when you have extra time, when your schedule allows, or when others understand. But real self-love doesn't work that way. It's not occasional. It doesn't only show up on good days. It's a constant stance toward life, a quiet commitment to not betray yourself, even when no one is watching. It took me a while to understand that. I thought I loved myself because once in a while, I took time for myself, did something I enjoyed, or said no when I was already exhausted. But in reality, I kept ignoring my limits every day. I kept settling for less than I deserved, postponing important decisions, and swallowing discomfort just to keep external peace, even if it cost me my inner peace. The turning point came when I realized that self-love isn't a one-time gesture. It's a pattern. It's not about choosing yourself one day. It's about choosing yourself every day, especially in the small things. It's respecting your exhaustion before it becomes burnout. It's honoring your intuition before it turns into anxiety. It's leaving the wrong situations before they become deep wounds. When you consistently respect yourself, something shifts. People begin to feel your boundaries without needing long explanations. Decisions become clearer. Guilt fades, and that inner conflict stops. Not because life is perfect, but because you stopped abandoning yourself. Consistent self-love builds such a solid inner foundation that you no longer need to prove yourself, explain yourself, or try to fit in. You simply remain true to yourself. Comment, I respect myself every day. That phrase confirms that your self-love is no longer occasional. It's a real commitment. Sixth topic. Self-love won't save you from pain, but it will stop you from destroying yourself because of it. One of the biggest myths about self-love is thinking that once you love yourself, pain disappears. It doesn't. You'll still get frustrated, disappointed, and hurt. The difference is, you won't abandon yourself in the process. Self-love isn't about avoiding pain. It's about not self-destructing when it comes. I learned this during a time when everything seemed to fall apart at once. Relationships crumbling, plans failing, expectations broken. In the past, I would have reacted by blaming myself, shrinking, trying to fix everything alone. But something was different. For the first time, I treated myself with respect in the middle of the pain. I allowed myself to feel without punishing myself. I walked away from what hurt me without creating drama. I asked for help without shame. And that was revolutionary, because I realized that self-love didn't shield me from pain. It protected me from myself. It kept me from making impulsive decisions, from returning to places that wounded me, from confusing longing with lack of self-worth. When you love yourself, pain doesn't become your identity. It becomes a passage. You're no longer defined by what you lost, by what went wrong, or by who rejected you. You understand that suffering is part of life, but it doesn't have to be the center of it. Self-love is sitting with pain without letting it drive your life. It's holding space for what hurts, without abandoning yourself in the process. It's moving through hard times with both gentleness and strength. Comment, I hold myself without destroying myself. That phrase affirms that you've learned to feel without losing yourself, and that's emotional maturity. Seventh topic, self-love changes the way you allow yourself to be treated. There's a quiet moment when self-love begins to become visible. It's not when you talk about it, or when you post inspirational quotes. It's when you realize that certain behaviors no longer fit, not because you became demanding, but because you became aware of your worth. Self-love changes your standards of acceptance, and that transforms all of your relationships. I had that moment when I started noticing that things I used to tolerate began to deeply bother me. Cold replies, empty promises, lack of reciprocity. Before, I used to explain them away, let them slide, justify them. I told myself I was overreacting, that no one's perfect. But slowly, I realized it wasn't about being demanding. It was about being coherent. I was growing, and those things no longer aligned with me. When you love yourself, you don't need to fight to be respected. You simply walk away from what doesn't respect you. You don't make long speeches. You don't try to convince anyone of your worth. You observe, you feel, and you decide. And that decision is quiet, but final. Self-love teaches you that affection shouldn't hurt, presence shouldn't be confusing, and love shouldn't leave you in a constant state of doubt. It teaches you that reciprocity isn't a luxury, it's the bare minimum. And when you change what you accept, the world rearranges itself around you. Aligned people draw near. Shallow connections fade away. Not as punishment, but as a natural consequence of your new internal standard. Comment, I only accept what is mutual. That phrase affirms that you no longer negotiate your worth to maintain connections. Eighth topic. Self-love teaches you to be alone without feeling empty. One of the greatest signs of self-love is how you handle your own company. Not forced loneliness, but being with yourself without anxiety, without panic, without the constant need for distraction. When you love yourself, silence stops being a threat and becomes a refuge. It took me a long time to learn this. For years, I filled every empty space with people, conversations, noise. Anything to avoid being alone with my thoughts. I thought being alone meant failure, rejection, or lack. But at some point, I realized I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of listening to myself. Self-love began to grow the moment I stopped running from silence. When I accepted sitting with myself without judgment, without pressure, without the urgency to fix everything. At first, it was uncomfortable. Silence exposes wounds, memories, and truths you've been avoiding. But then, it soothes. It organizes. It strengthens. When you learn to be alone without feeling empty, something powerful happens. You stop accepting relationships just to fill space. You stop confusing presence with love. You stop clinging out of fear of being alone. You start choosing, not holding on. Self-love doesn't isolate you from the world. It connects you to yourself in such a deep way that no external absence can shake you. You understand that companionship is a bonus, not your salvation. Comment, my own company is enough. That phrase marks the transition from emotional dependence to internal autonomy. Ninth topic. Self-love isn't putting yourself above others. It's stopping putting yourself below. There's a dangerous misconception about self-love that drives many people away from it. The idea that loving yourself makes you selfish, cold, or arrogant. But true self-love doesn't place you above anyone. It simply removes you from the place of inferiority you were taught to occupy. It doesn't create arrogance, it creates balance. I noticed this when I started standing my ground more firmly. Some people didn't take it well. They said I had changed, become distant, full of myself. At first it hurt. I doubted myself, thought maybe I was overdoing it. But with time, it became clear. Their discomfort didn't come from my change. It came from the end of my emotional submission. When you love yourself, you don't have to shrink to fit in, you don't have to apologize for existing, and you don't have to justify your boundaries. You understand that your worth doesn't depend on anyone's approval, and that completely changes the way you move through life. Your voice becomes steadier, your choices more conscious, your presence more respected. Self-love doesn't make you unreachable, it makes you whole. You start standing your ground without attacking, disagreeing without guilt, walking away without resentment. Because it's not about proving your strength, it's about protecting your dignity. When you stop putting yourself beneath others, you don't create conflict. You create filters. Some people will leave, others will adjust, and some will finally see the real you. Comment, I stand in my place. That phrase affirms that you don't need to rise above anyone to love yourself. You just need to stop staying on the ground where you were taught to stay. 10th topic. Self-love isn't a destination. It's the standard you uphold. Maybe the biggest truth no one tells you about self-love is this. It's not something you achieve and that's it. It doesn't arrive as a final point or an emotional trophy. Self-love is the standard you choose to uphold when life tests you. It's what you do when you're tired, when you're unsure, when no one is validating your choices. I realized this when I noticed that the most important moments weren't the ones of total clarity, but the ones full of doubt. Those were the moments when I had to choose whether to go back to old versions of myself, easier, more familiar, or to uphold the woman I was becoming. Self-love on those days wasn't pretty. It was steady. It was silent. It was staying. Self-love is keeping your boundaries even when you miss someone. It's trusting your intuition even when fear tries to bargain. It's continuing to choose yourself even when the urge to self-abandon disguises itself as comfort. It doesn't save you from relapses, but it keeps you from living in them. When you understand this, you stop looking for outside validation to confirm whether you're loving yourself the right way. You feel it, and you act on it. Self-love stops being a concept and becomes a non-negotiable internal standard. Comment, I uphold the love I have for myself. That phrase affirms that you no longer chase self-love, you practice it. The truth about self-love is that it doesn't promise you a perfect life. It promises you an honest one. A life where you don't have to betray yourself to belong, or shrink yourself to be loved. It pulls you away from what hurts, draws you closer to what's real, and teaches you to stay, even when everything feels uncertain. Self-love doesn't shout. It doesn't show off. It doesn't prove itself. It remains. In small decisions. In quiet boundaries. In choices no one sees. But that change everything. If this video made sense to you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. I choose not to abandon myself. Because in the end, that's what self-love is. The daily decision to stay on your side, no matter what it costs.